talking about the endocrinological activity of these various ovarian steroids. Not all ovarian hormones are steroid. Right? We talked about inhibin and activin and follistatin. When I say ovarian, I mean gonadin, because we're talking about the male reproductive system here. But I just want you to be sure you understand that the gonads are secreting both steroidal and peptide hormones. We indicated that the steroid hormones are bound in transit. This is consistent with what we talked about before. A couple of important things to keep in mind with respect to the transport of androgens, predominantly attached to blood-bound proteins of various types. And what I would have you notice again is that less than half are actually bound to the sex hormone binding globulin. And the reasons for that aren't clear, but we do know that, for example, females have a higher concentration of SHBG than males, and that's going to be clinically important. Something it's not going to be so important in this class, but it will be important in your patho and clinical courses later. And then we also pointed out that males have the ABP, which is structurally analogous, if not identical to SHBG. And then we talked about the fact of the eventual fate of the testosterone, the fact that testosterone and DHT both bind to the same androgen receptor or the same family of androgen receptors. When we argue that DHT is more potent, all that means is that the receptor binds DHT preferentially. So there's a greater avidity, there's no potency, there's no magic there. And then, of course, don't forget the importance of both the 5-alpha, not only the 5-alpha reductase reaction, which is the conversion of testosterone to DHT, but very important, and the more we learn about this reaction, the more important it seems to become these aromatization reactions. Aromatase is, again, I would encourage you maybe to think about being a histologist, because oftentimes the complexity of these pathways become very, very difficult to completely understand. But I indicated, for example, if you were to stain a Sertoli cell for androgen receptors, would you find positive staining? Would there be androgen receptors in a Sertoli cell? Yes, yes. So sometimes it's best just to think about, can I detect these receptors in this tissue? And the point I'm making in the context of aromatase is there are very few tissues in the reproductive system. And I would go so far as to say very few tissues in general that do not have aromatase activity. And so why is aromatase important? Because we're converting androgens to estrogens, and that means that if there are estrogen receptors in that tissue, it's basically going to be, to at least the first approximation, those receptors are going to be activated to the extent that the aromatase is present. All right, because aromatization is going to generate the estrogen, which then binds to the estrogen receptors. And these estrogen receptors, as implied here, are not only in the reproductive system doing a lot of important things, but they're in your nervous system, they're in your bones, they're in your cartilage, they're all over the place. Yeah.
Is androgen binding protein relegated only to the gonad?
The problem there is one of nomenclature. So if you accept that ABP and SHBG are identical, the obvious answer is no. But generally, when we talk about ABP, androgen binding protein, we're talking about usually the Sertoli cell. And then this is probably something worth keeping in mind. My goodness, it's in the news all the time. I guess that for the past 5 or 6 years, this has been a raging debate. What are echoestrogens? Didn't I see somebody looking at the bottom of their water bottle the other day? What are you looking for when you look at the bottom of your water bottle or your drinking container? Yeah. Well, yeah, you're looking at those numbers, and everybody know the number code, supposedly safe plastics. And what do we mean by safe plastics versus unsafe plastics? Are there really any safe plastics? If you believe we're going back into vitamin D territory here. So what are echoestrogens? These are basically substances in the environment that have estrogenic activity. Later on, you're going to be studying EA all the time. EA is going to crop up all the time, estrogenic activity. And a lot of these plastics, again, if you believe the hype, I'm not a chemical engineer, but the current thinking is that most plastics, the phthalates, the BPA, bisphenol A, this TDTE or whatever it is, virtually, even some of the polyethylenes, probably leach molecules that have estrogenic activity. Now, why is that important? Why is that of concern to you as a PA? Why should you be in a plastic panic? Okay, to what end though? And who is likely to suffer most from this? Okay, but so they're coming from the drink, but why? What is the physiological or developmental consequence that you need to be concerned about? What is the associated height? The gender benders, right? The idea that not only would mature adult fertility sperm count be perhaps lowering for this reason, but developmentally, you can see gender bending chemicals may affect the development of young males, and perhaps for that matter even females. So by echoestrogens, we're talking about not only chemicals in the environment. I use the example of plastics, but there are a number of chemicals in the environment, such as are present in certain pesticides and so on that have this activity. This whole notion of estrogenic activity is cropping up all the time, and again, a lot of folks are very alarmed about it. It's something you should be, I think, at least familiar with. What are phytoestrogens, for example? Even the plants hate us. What? Oh yes, yes, soy gets a bad rap. Yeah. So you don't like, anybody drink soy milk? Soy, what do they call it? Milk? Soy juice. But there are a number of these. So what do we mean by a phytoestrogen? A plant chemical or substances in a plant that also have estrogenic activity. I've never seen a group so docile in the face of the plastic menace. So just be familiar with the concept of echoestrogens and phytoestrogens and the potential risk. All right, let's talk a little bit about the activity, the physiological or pharmacological activity of androgens. Recall, our general thesis was that it's not the chromosomes that are responsible for sex. In fact, I challenge you to even tell me what it means to deem someone a male or female. The times are changing. And so if you have as a patient one of these individuals who are pseudo-hermaphroditic or have Swyer syndrome or so on, there is the biological issue, and then there's also the gender issue, which again we're not going to get into in here. But I want to make sure you understand that the differentiation and development are largely endocrine. That's, for example, how you have congenital adrenal hyperplasia being responsible for genetic females who nevertheless may be reared as males, at least initially, or criminally for that matter. So understand when we talk about the female default that a lot of things have to fall in place. Not only do the chromosomes and TDF and the androgen and the testosterone and all of these things the receptors have to be present. All of these things have to be present in order for normal and complete male differentiation to occur. And certainly testosterone and testosterone receptors are critical to that end. So what are the important dimorphic differences? Again, when you read of the travails of Lance Armstrong and these other bicyclists, what were they doing apparently in their travel trailer at nights? They were doping themselves with EPO. We'll talk about EPO later, but EPO is a hormone that's elevated in males. Males have a higher red blood cell count. They have a higher capacity for carrying oxygen in the blood. And this in part is attributable to both EPO and testosterone, because testosterone boosts RBC count, which is what we call the hematocrit. And then you can see the whole host of secondary sexual characteristics here: male pattern, body hair. I talked about the important, the distinctiveness conferred upon an individual by having a bald pate. We all agreed on that. The voice change that occurs in the male at puberty, hypertrophy, the skin tends to be a little thicker, at least physiologically, if not psychologically. Increased muscle mass, anywhere from 11 to 20%, depending on a variety of factors. Bones tend to be a little larger and thicker. And then we also talked about the fact that the expression of these androgens has consequences for the growth of the developing child. For example, a high testosterone infant, male infant, is likely to, as we pointed out, have a very rapid growth initially. You probably had some friends when you were young that grow very rapidly initially, but that their vital height terminated about 5'6", 5'7", that region. And it also has an implication for when the epiphyses close. The epiphyses are the growth plates that occur in the ends of the long bones. Sometimes the relationship is fairly clear. So, for example, we would expect individuals, children with high testosterone initially, to be shorter than normal. We talked about Klinefelters. Klinefelters individuals, XXY, are taller or shorter? Usually taller. All right. That's two X's and a Y, not one X and two Y's. Klinefelters. But then I don't know if I mentioned the super males. They are sometimes difficult to predict. You would think they would be like the high testosterone individuals. Not always the case. Sometimes poly Y individuals are taller than normal, and so sometimes the genetics don't fit our expectations. This was in the news a few years ago. A man found out he has testicular cancer from taking a pregnancy test. He didn't know why he was peeing on the stick there, but in any case, he found that he had a choriocarcinoma, which increased the concentration of human chorionic gonadotropin in his urine. And, or he might have been pregnant, I don't know. And we also mentioned that, the male testosterone level tends to decrease in the proximity of our offspring, and oxytocin levels go up. So there's an inverse relationship between testosterone and oxytocin in the proximity of children. I guess that's developmentally advantageous, because we've all heard of roid rage. All right, any questions about the male? I didn't have time to the female here, so let's talk a bit about female reproductive physiology.
The major structures of the female reproductive system are the two ovaries.
Excuse me a second.
Two fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. A normal female is capable of reproducing from the onset of menstruation during puberty until the end of menopause. The female is fertile and able to become pregnant approximately during the 13th and 14th days of each menstrual cycle. The total number of eggs a woman will produce in her lifetime are present in her ovaries when she is born. Each month at the beginning of a menstrual cycle, the pituitary gland secretes the follicle-stimulating hormone, which is commonly known as FSH. This hormone stimulates one egg to mature with an ovary. The maturing egg is surrounded by a Graafian follicle. On the 13th or 14th day of the menstrual cycle, the Graafian follicle ruptures and releases the mature egg from the ovary. Because the fallopian tube is not attached to the ovary, the finger-like fimbriae must catch the egg and guide it into the fallopian tube. After the release of the egg, the Graafian follicle changes and becomes the corpus luteum, which secretes the hormone progesterone in preparation of the lining of the uterus to support a pregnancy. If the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum dies and the progesterone secretion ceases. The menstrual cycle is then completed with a menstrual period. If the egg is fertilized as it travels down the fallopian tube, the corpus luteum continues to produce progesterone. The fertilized egg moves into the uterus where it is implanted. The placenta forms, and for the duration of the pregnancy, it secretes the progesterone required to maintain the pregnancy. Throughout the 40 weeks of the pregnancy, necessary nutrients are supplied and waste products are removed by the placenta and the umbilical cord. When it is time for the baby to be born, the pituitary gland secretes the hormone oxytocin. This hormone stimulates the labor contractions that result in the birth of the child. After the infant has been delivered, the final stage is the delivery of the placenta as the afterbirth.
So that's a good summary. There are a few points there that we need to refine a bit. So I've made this point about 12 times now, so be sure you understand it, that if an individual is born or for whatever reason lacks gonads, what will be the phenotype? Female. All right, is that clear? There's very little ambiguity there, unless there's some other pathology or some other issue. So the female phenotype is always going to appear to one degree or another if all of that long succession of events necessary for male differentiation do not occur. We indicated that virtually all of the female reproductive structures are developed or evolved from the Mullerian ducts, sometimes called perinephric ducts. So it's important to understand that whereas testosterone and the testes and the products of testosterone are necessary for complete male differentiation, the ovaries are not necessary for female phenotype. Now, reproductive viability and functionality are a different issue. So the ovaries will develop if that SRY gene is absent. We pointed out that fetal differentiation in the female is a little later than it is in the males. Typically in the males, we're talking about the 6th to 7th week. In the female, the ovary, the gonads begin to differentiate and appear 9 to 10 weeks. And some of the other critical primary structures are also evident by 9 or 10 weeks. So as I pointed out a moment ago, the Mullerian ducts give rise to the entire reproductive system that you see there, with the exception of perhaps the distal third of the vagina, which is more of a perineal or urogenital structure. Also, because I'm not sure how much time we're going to have in the anatomy, I know this new schedule really concerns me. Let's talk about some of the basic anatomy that even in the physiology you need to know. Certainly, you need to be aware that what we're looking at here is the uterus. The large structure in the middle there is the uterus. The cervix is inferior, the fundus is superior in the cervix. We'll look at a better picture of that in just a moment. Extending from the uterine horns, these would be the uterine horns here, are the uterine tubes. That's the preferred terminology now, also called the fallopian tube. And in all the illustrations, virtually all the illustrations, you will see inferior to the fallopian tubes are the ovaries. You can see the ovaries on either side here. And in that animation, you saw the ovulation, for example, occurring. This would be an ovulating ovary, and then the egg and the associated granulosa cells would be taken into the fimbrium here, and then conducted along the uterine tube. In addition, be familiar with some of this connective tissue you see here. For example, all of this connective tissue is called the broad ligament. And the broad ligament may be in that conformation, or, and the point that is, again, as I'm having senior moments these days, the point I was trying to make earlier is that you should not expect in any given patient this anatomical relationship to obtain. Sometimes the broad ligament will be highly convoluted, folded. Sometimes the ovary will be at the same level or even superior to the uterine tube. But this would be I guess my point is there's a great deal of variation, but this would be the more normal or the most normal of the organizational relationships. And then you can see a couple of other ligaments here. There's a ligament here extending medially called the ligament of the ovary. And then there's a ligament that sort of extends posterolaterally called the suspensory ligament of the ovary. And then if we have time, we'll talk more about these ligaments later, because they're very similar to the peritoneal tissue we'll talk about in the abdominal cavity. Remember, all of this, we don't really see it here, but we did see it in a previous illustration. All of this is covered superiorly by a abdominal membrane called the peritoneum. So this is sort of walled off. These reproductive structures are sort of walled off by that osteal membrane. So part of our focus in our very simple sketch of reproductive physiology, female reproductive physiology, will be to look at what's called the ovarian cycle. The reproductive cycle goes by a variety of names. We'll try to work through that terminology in just a moment. But if you look at the figure in the lower right here, we're looking at gonadotropin levels developmentally. So the red line is FSH, the yellow line is LH. So you'll notice a couple of things here. In gestation, gonadotropin levels surge, which is sort of express it that way. Shortly after birth, and then up through maybe the first few months of birth, you would expect also a surge in gonadotropin levels, probably for reasons that have to do with the removal of the maternal circulation. And then from the first year until about puberty, what you'll notice is gonadotropin levels are pretty low. They remain fairly low. And then with the onset of puberty, there's an increase in gonadotropin levels. And then when the female, what tends to happen is the cyclicity begins at puberty, and as the figures at the top show, that typically begins in the night, begins during the nighttime hours. And the ovarian cycles, the female cycles, then will continue from puberty until menopause. This is representing menopause here. And then finally, we see the gonadotropin levels increasing dramatically after menopause. Why would that be? By the way, what do we mean by menopause? What is the implication there? The ovaries are no longer producing the primary hormone. And we're going to talk about, we've already indicated that, for example, the testes generate testosterone, DHT, and some peptides. Well, if the ovaries are no longer releasing normal amounts of estrogen, does that give you some idea as to why the gonadotropins would be elevated at menopause? What is keeping these suppressed? What are contraceptive pills? How do contraceptive pills act? Any of you guys taking contraceptive pills? The contraceptive pills are basically just usually combinations of estrogen and progesterone. All right, so what do those things do? What effect would they have on the gonadotropins? Negative feedback, inhibitory feedback. So in this case, in menopause, the inhibitory feedback is gone, and so the gonadotropins are elevated. So just be aware of this sort of developmental relationship. That's really all we're looking for. Again, the monthly cycles typically begin at puberty, highly variable in your pediatrics course. I said curves, well, some students do it that way. In your pediatrics course, you'll learn about precocious or delayed puberty and some of the causes for that. But under normal circumstances, you would expect puberty and something called menarche, the sloughing off of the uterine lining, to begin at about that time. There is another term up there with which you should be familiar, adrenarche. Adrenarche in the normal female normally appears a year or two before menarche and refers to the endocrinological increased activity of the adrenal cortex. In females, what is the adrenal cortex cranking out that might be important for phenotype and reproductive physiology? The androgens, right. And so during adrenarche, you typically have changes, for example, axilla changes in the axilla, changes in the groin region, body hair, body odor, changes associated with an increase or upregulation of the adrenocortical hormones. So we're looking at sort of an archetypical ovary here, and you can see that in this idealized representation of the ovary, we have what is sometimes called a hilus or hilum. That's a word we'll talk about for the remainder of the course. A hilum is simply a region of connective tissue that attaches to the gland or organ, providing blood vessels, lymphatic drainage, neural innervation, autonomic innervation, and so on. So this is sort of the supply channel, if you will, and the waste removal channel. That's called the hilum or hilus. And then continuing into the ovary from that point is the medulla. So all of this would be medulla, and you can see it's highly vascularized. The tissue around the medulla, radiating into the cortex would be out here, is tissue called stroma. It's a general anatomical term. It is not specific to the ovaries. The term stroma is used to describe everything from breast tissue to other types of dense connective tissue. But in this case, the stromal tissue is just the parenchymal tissue that is surrounding these things, which are the follicles. So you can see the follicles at various stages in the ovary. So I guess what we want to make sure we understand here is the general anatomical organization of the ovary, what stromal tissue is, and cortex and medulla, and so on. So in this idealized representation of the ovary here, you see some very small follicles, and you see some very large follicles, and in fact they have different colors. And please be sure you understand that in a true ovary, you don't have tiny follicles on this end and big follicles on that end and yellow follicles at the bottom. These are all going to be present, sort of interspersed, more or less randomly in the cortex of the ovary. But you'll notice the smallest of these structures are, here they're calling them primary. They actually begin as primordial. Primordial means original, primal or original. The primordial follicles give rise to primary follicles, which then give rise to secondary follicles, and we'll talk about the anatomical features of these in just a moment. Then, as you saw in the animation, what happens on a monthly basis is not this progression. That takes about a year. What happens on a monthly basis is this, from about this point on. And based upon changing gonadotropin levels and some other things we'll talk about, one of these follicles will become a mature, I say one, sometimes more than one, but generally only one of these will become a mature or Grothian follicle. Should happen on a monthly basis. And you can see that mature or Grothian follicle will then, once it's the one that's selected, will undergo ovulation. What we're looking at here is ovulation that occurs at the midway point in the reproductive cycle, or ovarian cycle. And in the course of ovulation, you'll notice the oocyte, and that's what this is. In each one of these follicles, there's an oocyte. And depending upon the developmental stage, the oocyte is going to be surrounded by some cells. For the most part, these are granulosa cells. And then, by the time we get to the secondary stage, we see little pools of fluid that's called antral fluid. But my point here is that ovulation, the oocyte, along with the granulosa cells, are all extruded, expelled from the ovary. So the oocyte is gone now, at that point. After ovulation, we're into what's called the luteal phase of the cycle, and what's left of that follicle becomes a corpus luteum, or yellow body. As you saw in the animation, that corpus luteum has very important endocrinological activity, but in the absence of fertilization of the egg, it will undergo progressive deterioration, degeneration. And you can see it getting smaller here until it eventually becomes, they don't show it here, but eventually becomes a white body, a corpus albicans. And depending upon who you believe, that tissue is no longer endocrinologically active, and in most respects, it's basically just scar tissue. So, we all understand the terminology used to describe. By the way, notice the term up here. You had the password gametogenesis. Now we're talking about folliculogenesis, generation and development of follicles. The follicles are those structures inside the ovary that contain the oocytes, the the oocytes that will progressively mature and then be extruded upon cyclic ovulation. Yes, I'm sorry.
For the regression of the corpus luteum, like does that take about a month as well? Or?
That's a good question, and you reminded me of this word that I need to throw in as well. When those follicles undergo that degeneration, that is said to be, that process of degeneration is called atresia. And so an atretic follicle is a follicle that is involuted and is decaying. Now, with respect to your question, if you look back at this numbers here, in gestation, at about mid-gestation, the normal female is going to have about 7 million or so oogonia. What are oogonia? Yeah, these are stem cells that give rise to the primary oocytes, the secondary oocytes, and then things get confusing. I don't know what to tell you about the terminology. I'm going to leave that up to you. But certainly these give rise to the primary oocytes. And you'll notice here, it says about 500,000 primary oocytes. These are present in gestation. So what happened to all these others? I guess my point, what I want you to understand is this process of atresia or degeneration of oogonia and oocytes occurs in gestation, and there's progressive loss, diminution in the number, and that's ongoing. That just happens throughout. So let me make sure, because it's stated several times in the notes, but let me make sure you understand what I'm saying. The maximum number, the highest number of oogonia and oocytes are present during gestation, before birth in the female, and the number only decreases after that. So if you look at, this is either a baleen whale or an ovary. So if you look at this ovary here, what you'll see are follicles of different sizes and types, and we don't even see all of them here. But what's the fate of most of these? Yeah, atresia. So if you do the arithmetic, I don't know if I have it here. Yeah. If you do the arithmetic, how many follicles will undergo ovulation in the lifespan of a normal human female? How would you arrive at that number? What arithmetic would you do to arrive at that number? Okay, yeah. So the 40 you're picking is how do you get? Okay, so you're saying from puberty to menopause, and you're saying a monthly cycle. So what happens to all the others? Yeah, to one degree or another, they do not develop, or they simply undergo degeneration. And I want to make the point as well, yeah, you can see some of the addition, about 500 million by puberty. And we'll talk about this terminology in more detail, but I want to make the point once again. I think I have it in here several times. Yes, right here, for example. So when we talk about the monthly cycle, we're only talking about, when we talk about the ovarian cycle, which we're going to elaborate in just a moment, we're only talking about the endocrinological release of hormones responsible for ovulation. To the time required for a oocyte to go from a primordial follicle to a mature follicle takes about a year if it happens at all. So is that clear that the monthly cycle only refers to the formation and selection? So if the room here, if we're filled with follicles, I'm sorry, we're an ovary, and each one of you is a follicle, how is it determined which one of you is going to go ovulation on any given month? Yeah, we don't know. But one of you is selected to bear that honor. And we don't know. That's one of many things we don't know about this process. And typically only one. So this is a nifty illustration over here on the right. I think this comes from Netter, so you may want to get a larger version of it here. But what this shows us is the relationship between gametogenesis. Remember we talked about meiosis with respect to the oocytes. And then over on the right, the relationship between meiosis and folliculogenesis. So for example, in this illustration, remember we said that all of the oogonia that are present, the highest number, are going to be present in gestation in the ovary before birth. And so that's indicated up here, upper left, the highest number. And at that point, prior to birth in the follicle, the end of the gestating female is only going to have primordial follicles. The primordial follicles are basically just oocytes with a single layer of cells around them. Very, very simple structures. And then with birth up to puberty, we have commencement of the ovarian or monthly cycles. At that point, then again, we quibble a little bit with the way this is represented, but you get the evolution from the primary to the mature follicles. Now, you remember our discussion of meiosis? When does meiosis begin in the female? Yeah. Meiosis 1 begins in gestation. And then when is meiosis 1 completed in oogenesis? Just before each ovulation, just before each of the monthly ovulatory. That's when meiosis 1 is completed, and meiosis 2 begins. And if you remember from our previous discussion, meiosis 2 is only completed when what occurs? Fertilization. Yeah. Which again creates problems for our terminology later. Do you have this slide? Did I put this in your? You don't mind. So let's just quick, because if you look at the previous one, they use an unorthodox terminology. I'm not sure where I obtained this, but they're talking about primary multilaminar and primary unilaminar follicles. That's just public silliness. I've never heard that terminology before. So what I want you to know, you can just take a few notes here. But the primordial follicle is an oocyte with a slender ring of squamous granulosa cells. These blue cells here are granulosa cells. They're going to play an important role in our story, so make sure you're familiar with those. The primary follicle is very similar to the primordial follicle, as you saw in some of the text illustrations. There's not even a distinction. The distinction is more developmental than structural, but you can see in the primary follicle we have a much more complete single layer of granulosa cells at the perimeter of the follicle. And then with the secondary follicle, several things happen. You begin to see multiple layers of granulosa cells, and I don't really like the way this is rendered, but the typical representation of the secondary follicle is that there are little regions of the white that you see there, which is called antral fluid. Antral fluid. Antral fluid. And these just begin to appear sort of in the midst of the granulosa cells. The secondary follicle will then develop into, they use the term tertiary here, but we're going to call that a mature or Grothian follicle. That is at the edge of my resolution there, so I don't know if you can read that or not. Grothian follicle. And what do you notice about the Grothian follicle? It has this little peninsula extending into the antrum. So that fluid, that white region that you saw up there, that is now coalesced into just one large lake that is now called the antrum. And that peninsula extending into the antrum includes the oocyte and at least one layer, sometimes multiple layers, of granulosa cells. By the way, there's one additional feature that I failed to acknowledge in the secondary follicle. The The secondary follicle is characterized by another type of cell in addition to the granulosa cells, and these are at the very margin or perimeter of the follicle. These are called fecal shells. Fecal shells. Fecal cells. The reason for that Freudian slip is because you've encountered that term before. Where did you encounter fecal before? Remember that very pleasant surgical video we saw? The back. What is the lumbar cistern also called? The fecal sac. The fecal. So fecal, the reason I said fecal shell is because that's what a feca is. A feca is a shell. And in fact, anybody know what a diatom is or a dinoflagellate? Those are marine creatures, and their little shells are called feca. So it all means the same thing. It's the shell around the structure. So the fecal cells, and they're going to be important too. We need to keep those in mind. So we have now two types of cells, and they're both present in the mature follicle. The fecal cells at the perimeter, you can sort of see them out here, and the granulosa cells surrounding the oocyte. This goes by a variety of names. It's sometimes they're called the radiant crown, the corona radiata, that's surrounding the oocyte there. And then this entire assembly, this entire structure of the oocyte and the surrounding granulosa cells, at ovulation will be extruded, will be expelled from the ovary. And you sort of see that here. Yeah.
Is there a distinction between the white layer and the light purple layer on the inside of the antrum?
Yeah, I agree with you. That's that's a little disturbing. Not to me, because this would all be antral fluid in a mature follicle. So I'm not sure what they're indicating by that. You can see again, so hopefully at this point you would recognize that the follicle that we're looking at here, how would you classify it in terms of its developmental stage? Yeah, that's a mature or Grothian follicle because you see the oocyte, you see the granulosa cells, again this is the corona radiata, and maybe this is what they're showing in that illustration, probably debris or some other histological manifested inside that antrum, but this would be the large antral lake. And then out here would be the perimeter fecal cells. We need to keep in mind because they're going to play an important role in our endocrinological discussion. All right, so I think we've already talked about this. We've already talked about the relationship between the ovarian cycle and meiosis. So let's begin our discussion of the ovarian cycle. Now, I've given you, let's see, what here, 1, 2, 3, you probably have at least 4 or 5 illustrations of the ovarian cycle. And the reason I included so many is because you need to know that thoroughly. You need to know these, if nothing else, learn these figures quite thoroughly. Having said that, you need to appreciate that there's probably not even one of them that is quite correct. There are errors in all of them. This is probably the closest to the correct. And it's not terribly important, except I know some of you are going to be disturbed that the descriptions that you read will not necessarily correlate to any one of these figures, and that's fine. We'll have an animation at the end that will hopefully clarify some of this. And in the time that we have, we don't have time to get into this in great detail either. But notice the following. First of all, when we talk about the ovarian cycle, we're primarily talking about really 2 things. The ovarian cycle refers to the developmental sequence in folliculogenesis, which we've already talked about, going from the primary follicle to the luteum, the corpus luteum. The other thing that is included in the ovarian cycle are the changes in the hormones with which we need to be familiar, both the gonadotropins and the primary hormones. So once again, by the ovarian cycle, and it goes by a variety of different names, we're talking primarily about what we see in these top 3 rows here. That's not going to, what is it? It's the 14th now. In about 2 weeks, that will never happen again. Because in Windows 10, that thing is gone. People love it. You know, anybody want to know what it's called? The charms. So that's the ovarian cycle, and this same sequence of events is referred to as the menstrual cycle, the reproductive cycle, the uterine cycle, again, the ovarian cycle. But technically, for our purposes, we're going to describe this, and this as the ovarian cycle. This down here, the changes in the uterine lining of the cervix, will be termed the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle. So this is the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle. All that up there, for the purposes of simplicity, we will describe as the ovarian cycle. All right, let's take a break and we'll begin the discussion of that.